Maryum is a gender equality activist who has been working at the intersection of strategy, policy, and advocacy for over a decade. She's speaking with us today in her personal capacity. She's a leading voice in the global movement to end female genital mutilation. As a survivor of FGM, she has written extensively on the importance of creating safe spaces for trauma-informed healing. It is with great honor and pleasure that I give the mic to Maryum Saifee.
Thank you, Maryum. I want to thank you and the Oslo Women's Rights Initiative for inviting me to keynote this year's annual event. When I first met Maryum in Oslo 2 years ago, and she told me about OWRI, I was struck by the power of this diverse network with everyone united around a common vision, building a more just and equitable world. And this means not taking any shortcuts. It means digging deep into root causes of violence and conflict in some of the toughest parts of the world and in some of the toughest, on some of the toughest issues. It's a tremendous privilege for me to be with you here today virtually. We're 1 year into the pandemic. And as Maryum mentioned, I'm speaking today in my personal capacity as an advocate for gender equality. As a survivor of FGM, I'm often invited to speak on panels, and I'm often asked to limit my remarks just to my story of trauma. People will ask me to retell what happened in graphic detail. And when I first became an activist in this movement, I sort of stumbled into the movement. I would do this. I thought it was necessary in order to, raise awareness and mobilize action. And I also convinced myself I was one of the lucky ones because my parents were actually fully supportive of my advocacy work. My father was the person who encouraged me to speak out in the first place. My situation is a bit different. My aunt cut me without their consent. So my parents were as outraged as I was about what happened. But for most FGM survivors, it's much more complex. FGM is a form of intergenerational, interfamily structural violence. Often the parents are complicit in the process, and there tends to be a tremendous amount of backlash for speaking out. In the 5 or so years I've been involved in this advocacy work, I've come to realize that the act of storytelling, this reenacting of the trauma, comes with a cost. And the storyteller, usually the trauma survivor, is the one who pays the price. So what do I mean by this? When we ask a trauma survivor to reenact their story, it can be dehumanizing. There is a commodification of both the storyteller and the story. The story becomes a product and the storyteller becomes collateral damage. This, romanticizing of resilience is actually what prompted Maryum and I to think through how can we flip the script where we can put the storyteller first. We did this by launching the Free to Be campaign last year, which Maryum mentioned in her remarks. We invited people to talk about how we can work towards building a world we want, a more just and equitable world, rather than the world we don't want. So in my world, that meant a world where all girls are free to be whole, free to live carefree childhoods, and just free to be safe, free to be. This meant rather than fixating on the violence, in the context of FGM, for example, adjudicating what type of cut is most harmful, we stopped the debate on this entirely, which is a pretty radical act. Instead, we reframed the narrative and talked about our vision, a world where all girls are free to be whole and free from any type of violence, any type of cutting. So we flipped the script. Not only we flipped the script on the narrative, but also we put the spotlight on the humanity of survivors, and we celebrated the multiplicity of their identities. We talked about how survivors and frontline activists, many of the folks in the OWRI community and the network, are more than their stories of activism and trauma, and that they should have a meaningful seat at the table, driving policy. Their voices should be driving policy. So for me, the OWRI network represents this collective power, harnessing the lived experiences and diverse perspectives of women on the front lines, powerful women who are critical to building a more just and equitable world, a world where all of us are free to just be. Thank you.